What if the smallest act of kindness rewrote an entire life? It started on a gray, wind-bitten morning when traffic snarled like restless beasts at the intersection of Pine and 8th. Horns screamed. Rain streaked across the city like veins of silver. And in the middle of it all stood a boy with a single crutch, trembling fingers, and a heart pounding faster than the storm around him. Ethan was 15. His right leg, encased in metal and straps, refused to bend. Every step was a battle between balance and gravity. Yet in that chaos of headlights and impatience, he noticed something no one else did. An old man, white cane tapping the curb, face tilted toward a sound he couldn't quite place. The man's other hand trembled, searching the air for something solid, something kind. No one stopped. People stared, some even walked around him, earbuds in, heads down, the world too loud to care. Ethan took a breath. The cold sliced through his jacket, but his mind was already crossing the street before his body did. He pushed forward, crutch sinking into puddles, cars blurring past, until he reached the man's side. "Sir," he said softly, voice shaking more from fear than the rain. "I'll help you cross." The man turned his head slightly as though trying to see with what was left of his hearing. "You will?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said, tightening his grip on the man's arm. Together they stepped forward. One boy with a broken leg, one man with broken sight, and somehow in that fragile balance between them they created something whole. Each step was measured, cautious. The blind man's cane tapping, Ethan's crutch clinking. The sound of survival in stereo. Cars hissed by, their tires throwing up sheets of water that splashed across their shoes, but neither flinched. When they finally reached the other side, the old man smiled, a small, tired smile that seemed to carry decades of silence behind it. "Thank you, son," he said, squeezing Ethan's hand. "People don't usually stop." Ethan just nodded, unsure what to say. He wanted to tell him it was nothing, but deep down it felt like everything. The man chuckled softly. "You walk with courage," he said, like someone who's lost and found the same thing more than once. Then he turned, cane tapping away into the mist, until he was gone. For a while Ethan stood there, listening to the sound fade, the tap, tap, swallowed by the city's noise. He didn't know the man's name or where he was going. But something about that brief moment, that exchange between weakness and strength, lit a spark in him. Later that night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but his thoughts hadn't. He sat by his window looking out at the city lights, wondering how many others walked alone like that, invisible, unheard. He thought of his own struggle, the surgeries, the pitying looks, the way kids at school avoided sitting next to him because his crutch made them uncomfortable. He wanted to do something. Not just for that man, but for all of them, the forgotten ones, the ones who fought battles the world didn't see. By morning, he had a name written on a scrap of notebook paper, the Second Step Foundation. It started small, a school project at first. He built a simple website using free templates. He wrote a mission statement that made his teacher cry, helping those who stumble take their next step. He collected old canes and crutches from hospitals, raised a few $100s online. But the world is strange about kindness. Sometimes it ignores it. Sometimes it magnifies it in ways no one can predict. 2 weeks later, a local news reporter caught the story. A 15-year-old disabled boy helping a blind man cross the street. A photo taken by a stranger had gone viral. It was everywhere, news feeds, morning shows, even billboards. People called him the boy with the brave heart. Donations started trickling in. Then pouring in, but not everyone was smiling, because somewhere, far away in a glass tower that scraped the clouds, a man saw that same photo and froze. He was older now, with silver hair and a face hardened by decades of business deals and boardroom wars. His name was Richard Hale, one of the wealthiest men in the country. A billionaire known for buying companies, not believing in causes. He had everything: yachts, penthouses, a name whispered in power circles. But that morning, as the photo filled his tablet screen, his hands trembled. Not because of the boy's act, but because of the boy himself. The crutch, the hair, the eyes. It was his son, Ethan Hale, the boy he hadn't seen in 5 years. The memory came back in sharp flashes. The hospital, the argument, the way his wife had screamed that money couldn't fix everything, how he'd walked out, promising he'd return when things made sense again. They never did. Now, there was his son helping a blind man, smiling through pain, while the world applauded. Richard closed the tablet, stood up, and stared out at the skyline. For the first time in years, he didn't see success. He saw failure, a life built on numbers and profit, while his own child learned compassion without him. Days later, the story reached a global charity summit. Ethan was invited to speak. His voice trembled on stage as he told the story of that rainy day, how one moment of courage can ripple through thousands of lives. He didn't mention his father. He didn't need to. But sitting in the audience, unannounced and unseen, Richard Hale listened. When Ethan spoke about helping those who've lost direction find hope again, Richard felt something break inside him. Years of silence, guilt, distance, all collapsing under the weight of one boy's kindness. After the speech, reporters swarmed Ethan. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. How did you come up with this idea? What drives you? Who inspires you most? Ethan smiled softly, eyes glimmering with quiet pain. Someone once told me that courage isn't about being unbroken, he said. It's about moving even when you're not whole. That night, long after the applause faded, a black car stopped outside his small house. A man stepped out dressed in a dark coat, face half hidden under the brim of his hat. He didn't knock right away. He stood at the door, listening to the muffled laughter inside, his son's laughter. Then he raised his hand and knocked. When the door opened, Ethan froze. His crutch slipped slightly. Dad? Richard's eyes glistened. Hey, champ. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Just years of silence hanging in the air between them. Then Richard knelt down, not caring that the cold pavement soaked his knees. I saw what you did, he whispered. I saw the man you're becoming. Ethan swallowed hard. You weren't there, he said quietly. All those years, I know. Richard's voice cracked. But I want to be now. And I want to help, not with words, with everything I have. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded check. Ethan stared, shaking his head. I don't want your money, Dad. Richard nodded. I know. But the world needs your idea, and I can help make it real. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan sighed, the fight in his chest softening into something else. Understanding, maybe. Okay, he whispered. But it's not my charity anymore. It's everyone's. Richard smiled, and a real one, the kind he hadn't felt in years. Then let's make sure everyone gets their second step. Weeks later, the Second Step Foundation had offices, staff, and programs across the country. Thousands of people, veterans, amputees, those living with disabilities, received aid. Ethan became a symbol of resilience, his story taught in schools and leadership programs. But the world never knew the full story, that the billionaire behind the massive donation wasn't just a philanthropist. He was a father trying to earn forgiveness, one act of kindness at a time. And every time Ethan saw the charity's logo, 2 footprints crossing a single line, he remembered that morning at the crosswalk. The rain, the blind man, the courage it took to move. Because sometimes the smallest step doesn't just change your path, it leads someone else home. But one night, months later, Ethan received a letter, no name, just a single line scrawled across the paper. You helped me cross that street. Now let me help you cross yours. The ink was smudged, but the signature was clear. It was from the blind man, and what he revealed next would change everything. The letter sat on Ethan's desk for hours before he opened it. The paper was creased, the ink slightly blurred as if written in haste or with trembling hands. The words were simple, uneven, but they carried a weight far heavier than their few lines deserved. You helped me cross that street. Now let me help you cross yours. And beneath it, a signature written in firm, deliberate strokes. Henry Lowell. The name meant nothing to Ethan at first. He reread it, again and again, searching for familiarity. Nothing. But something about the way it was written, calm, almost certain, made him feel as though this wasn't a stranger reaching out. It was an invitation. The next day, he showed the letter to his father. Richard stared at it for a long time, fingers pressing against his lips. Henry Lowell, he murmured. That name rings a bell. He stood pacing. I think he was someone from the foundation world years ago. disappeared from the public eye, used to fund educational programs for the blind, then suddenly stopped. No one knew why. Ethan looked at the letter again, its paper now trembling slightly in his hand. "He wants to meet," he said. "There's an address." "Where?" "An old conservatory on the edge of the city. Abandoned, from what I can tell." Richard frowned. "That doesn't sound safe." Ethan smiled faintly. Neither did helping a stranger in the middle of traffic. Rain was falling again when he arrived, thin, whispering rain that made the world look like it was underwater. The conservatory loomed ahead, a skeleton of glass and iron swallowed by vines. Its windows were shattered in places, its roof sagging with time, yet inside, a faint light glowed, steady, inviting. Ethan's crutch clicked softly on the wet tiles as he entered. The smell of damp earth and rust filled the air. Plants long untended reached toward the light filtering through broken panes. And there, at the far end, near what once had been a fountain, stood the blind man. He hadn't changed much. Same stooped posture, same white cane. But now his eyes seemed clearer, more focused somehow, as though he could see through the sound of footsteps alone. "Mr. Lowell?" Ethan called out. The man turned, smiling. "You remembered my name." "I only learned it yesterday." Lowell chuckled softly. "Then maybe you're faster than most." He motioned for Ethan to come closer. As Ethan approached, he noticed an old piano near the fountain, its wood warped but polished clean. Sheets of music rested atop it, handwritten, delicate. "I used to play here," Lowell said, sensing his gaze. "Before I lost my sight. This was my refuge. Now it's a memory I can still feel with my hands." Ethan sat opposite him. The air was cold, but something about the space felt alive, like the past hadn't completely left. "I owe you a thank you," Lowell said. "That day at the crosswalk, you didn't hesitate. I just did what anyone should have done. That's where you're wrong." Lowell tilted his head slightly, his smile fading. "Most people see weakness and turn away. You saw it and reached toward it." "That's rare, Ethan." Hearing his name from this man felt strange, almost intimate. "You knew who I was?" Ethan asked. "I did, after the story spread, but not before. I only learned later who the boy with the crutch was, and who his father is." Ethan hesitated. "You know my father?" Lowell nodded slowly. "Once. Long ago. Before he became who he is now." Ethan leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Lowell's fingers traced the top of his cane. "We built a charity together years before you were born. We called it Vision Forward. It was meant to help the blind find new independence through technology and education. Your father was the financial mind. I was the heart behind it. But something happened. A deal. A choice. He pulled out, and I lost everything." Ethan sat back, stunned. "You're saying my father—" "I'm saying," Lowell interrupted gently, "that people change when they start counting what things are worth, instead of what they mean." He smiled sadly. "But maybe people can change back too." Silence settled between them, filled only by the sound of rain against glass. Ethan looked down at his hands. "He's trying," he whispered. "He's really trying to make things right." "I know," said Lowell. "That's why I wrote to you. Because I think he's forgotten the part of himself that once believed in helping without asking what it costs. And I think you can remind him." Ethan frowned. "Why me?" "Because you already have." Lowell reached into his coat and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. "There's something in here your father never finished. Something he thought he'd buried with me. Give it to him, but promise me. Read it first." Ethan hesitated, then took it. The envelope was aged, the paper yellowed at the edges. "Why not give it to him yourself?" Lowell smiled faintly. "Because I'm not the one who can change his heart anymore. You are." As Ethan stood to leave, he turned back one last time. "Will I see you again?" Lowell's smile deepened. though his eyes were distant. You already have. The next morning, Ethan sat by his bedroom window again, just as he had on that first night when everything began. The city hummed below, restless and alive. He held the envelope between his fingers, turning it over in the light. His father knocked softly before entering. You went to see him, Richard said quietly. Ethan nodded. You knew him. Richard exhaled. I did, and I wronged him. We started Vision Forward together, but when investors pressured me to merge it into a larger corporate fund, I took the deal. Henry refused. He said charity should be led by conscience, not shareholders. He paused, voice low. I called him naive. He called me lost. We never spoke again. Ethan handed him the envelope. He said you'd understand. Richard took it carefully, sliding a finger under the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. He unfolded it slowly. Ethan watched as his father's expression shifted. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something like pain. What is it? Ethan asked. Richard didn't answer right away. He handed the paper to his son. It was a letter, dated nearly 16 years ago. Richard, if you're reading this, it means the world has changed faster than either of us could follow. You'll build empires, and I'll probably fade into quiet corners of cities that forget my name. But if someday you lose the reason why we started, remember this. The only real legacy is the people we lift when no one's watching. I've seen the look in your eyes when you talk about your boy. Hold on to that. If you can teach him to see what others overlook, he'll grow into everything you once hoped to be. Henry Ethan's throat tightened. He wrote this about me? Richard nodded, voice trembling. Before you were even born. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city outside continued as if nothing had changed, but inside something had shifted forever. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony, the city lights flickering like stars beneath his feet. The letter rested on the table beside him, its words echoing in his mind. He had built skyscrapers, companies, fortunes, but this letter reminded him of something he'd buried deep. Purpose. By morning, he had made a decision. The second step foundation was already growing fast, but Richard wanted to expand it in a way that honored what Henry had started. A new initiative that combined their causes: mobility, vision, and opportunity. He called it Forward Steps. It would provide rehabilitation technology to both the visually impaired and those with physical disabilities. But beyond that, it would stand as a public symbol of unity between two broken men and the boy who unknowingly healed them both. When Richard announced the project at a press conference, cameras flashed, questions fired, and applause thundered. But amid all the noise, Ethan saw only one thing: the empty space in the crowd where Henry should have been. Later, as the applause faded, a man in a gray coat approached quietly. He pressed a small object into Ethan's hand, a folded braille card. He wanted you to have this, the man said before walking away. Ethan ran his fingers over the raised dots, unsure how to read them, but something about the texture felt alive, like music frozen in place. He took it to a translator later that night. The message read, "Every bridge begins with one step. You've taken yours. Now, build the rest." Weeks passed. The project broke ground. Offices opened. New partnerships formed. But in the quiet, hours between meetings, Ethan often found himself returning to that old conservatory. It was empty now. No piano, no voice, just the echo of a man who once turned loss into purpose. One evening, he found a small plaque placed near the entrance, newly mounted. It read, "In memory of Henry Lowell, who taught others to see without sight." Below it, in smaller letters, someone had added, "Donated anonymously by R.H. Ethan smiled," tracing the initials with his thumb. His father had come full circle, not through wealth, but through humility. As he turned to leave, the rain began again, gentle, familiar. The same rain that had started it all, and in its rhythm he thought he heard something faint, a piano chord, soft and wavering, fading into the sound of the storm. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel broken. He felt connected to his father, to Henry, to every person who had ever taken a step when it hurt to move. But as he stepped out into the rain, his phone buzzed. A message. Unknown number, it read. The man you helped that day wasn't just blind. He was hiding from something. Find out what it was before others do. Ethan's heart stilled. He looked back at the conservatory, now just a shadow against the lightning sky. The story wasn't over, not even close. The message glowed on Ethan's screen like a quiet threat. The man you helped that day wasn't just blind. He was hiding from something. Find out what it was before others do. The words pulsed with an urgency that didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like a warning. He stood under the rain, motionless, the world around him blurring into streaks of silver and sound. The city hummed like an engine in the distance, indifferent to his growing unease. He read the message again, then a third time, trying to catch something he'd missed, a clue in the phrasing, a hint in the sender's number. Nothing, just unknown digits that looked freshly made, as if whoever sent it existed only for that single moment. When he finally walked home, his mind was a storm. Every word Henry had said now twisted into something uncertain. I used to play here, before I lost my sight. People can change back too. Was that truth or a crafted lie wrapped in sentiment? Why would a man like Henry Lowell, gentle, wise, broken, be hiding from anyone? By the time he reached the apartment, his father was awake, sitting in the living room with a mug of untouched coffee. The television played a muted news report, something about a data leak involving old charity funds. Richard looked up. "You're late," he said softly, studying his son's face. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, then showed him the message. Richard's jaw tightened as he read it. "Who sent this?" "I don't know," Ethan said. "But they knew something. About Henry." Richard rose slowly, setting the mug down with care. Henry didn't have enemies. He had ghosts, the people who took advantage of him after Vision Forward collapsed. There were lawsuits, investigations, none of it ever proved anything, but money vanished, reputations shattered. Maybe someone's still digging in the past. But why contact me? Richard met his eyes. Because you're visible now. Your name's everywhere. And because Henry trusted you. The air felt thick between them, heavy with unspoken worry. Ethan could sense his father's instinct to protect, to take control. But there was something else beneath it too. Guilt. The kind that doesn't fade, just hides under layers of achievement. That night, sleep refused him. He sat by the window again, watching the glow of the city fade into dawn. The memory of Henry's voice lingered. The calm steadiness, the way he'd said, "You already have," when Ethan asked if they'd meet again. The phrase suddenly felt different, almost coded, as if Henry knew this moment would come. He searched online for Henry Lowell, scrolling past the same news articles and archived charity records. Then one headline stopped him cold. Vision Forward co-founder presumed dead after missing for 6 years. He clicked. The article was old, dated nearly a decade earlier, but there it was. A report of a car crash on the coastal highway. The driver, Henry Lowell, was never found. Only his cane and personal belongings recovered from the wreck. Authorities ruled it accidental, though witnesses claimed the brakes had been tampered with. Ethan's pulse quickened. Henry Lowell was supposed to be dead. He stared at the photo embedded in the article. A younger Henry, eyes bright and full of conviction. The same face that had smiled at him under the dim glass roof of the conservatory. Except this photo had something different. Behind Henry stood another man, blurred but familiar. His father. The next morning, Ethan confronted him. Richard looked at the photo in silence, his expression unreadable. "That was taken just before everything fell apart," he said finally. Henry was already under pressure. The investors were threatening to pull out. He wanted to expose them publicly. I told him not to. That picture was from our last event together. Ethan's voice was steady but sharp, and then he disappeared. "Yes," Richard exhaled. "And I blamed myself for it. Because the night before that drive, we fought. I told him he was throwing his life away. He said I'd already thrown away mine." He paused, eyes distant. "When the news came, I didn't even go to the memorial." Ethan's chest tightened. Then how was he alive? Why didn't he come forward? Richard shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't want to be found." Ethan turned toward the window, rain tapping the glass again. He said he wanted to help me cross my street, he murmured. What if he meant more than that? That evening, Ethan returned to the conservatory. The light was gone this time. The door creaked open under his hand, revealing only darkness and the faint scent of dust and damp soil. His crutch echoed against the tiles. Henry? He called, voice low. No answer. But on the piano where Henry once sat, there was something new, a folder. Inside were old documents, yellowed ledgers, and a flash drive taped to the back. The label read, "For EH, when it's time." He pocketed it and hurried home, heart pounding with a mix of fear and wonder. The files on the drive were encrypted, but among them, one document opened easily. A letter, unsent, written in Henry's careful typing. If you're reading this, it means I trusted you. The truth isn't in what we built, but what we lost. Vision Forward was never meant to be destroyed, it was silenced. There are people who profited from that silence, and they've never stopped listening. Protect your father. He doesn't know what he stepped into. Ethan sat frozen. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and move with the flickering light of the screen. The noise of the city outside now felt distant, muffled. He turned to his father, who had just entered. Richard read the message in stunned silence, then looked up slowly, his expression darkening. Someone doesn't want this story coming back, he said. But why warn me? Ethan whispered. Because Henry thought you'd do what neither of us could. A sudden knock at the door startled them both. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Ethan's father tensed, moving toward the peephole. A courier stood there, holding a sealed envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photo, blurry, taken from a distance. It showed Henry standing outside the conservatory, not weeks ago, but days before the supposed meeting. Behind him, in the shadows, another figure watched, a man in a suit, face obscured, but the reflection in the nearby window caught enough to reveal something chilling. A corporate logo on the briefcase he carried. The same logo that had once represented Vision Forward. Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He was being watched. Richard nodded grimly. And now, so are we. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the walls for a brief, searing instant. When the thunder rolled a moment later, it felt like the sky itself had shifted. The truth that once felt redemptive now felt dangerous. Ethan's mind raced back to Henry's final words. You already have. Maybe it wasn't about helping or healing. Maybe it was a warning disguised as comfort. He looked at his father, whose expression had turned unreadable again, like someone seeing ghosts walk back into the room. Dad, Ethan whispered. What if Henry didn't just fake his death? What if someone helped him do it? Richard didn't answer right away. His gaze lingered on the photo, the blurred silhouette behind Henry. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, distant, almost afraid of itself. Then we're already part of something we don't understand. And for the first time since that day on the crosswalk, Ethan realized the line between helping and uncovering had blurred. The act that had begun with kindness was now unraveling into something larger, something that reached back into secrets buried before he was even born. The rain outside turned heavier, battering the glass with restless rhythm. The city lights flickered once, then dimmed into darkness. In the silence that followed, Richard whispered the words neither of them wanted to say aloud. They've found us. The power cut out in a single breath. The room swallowed by darkness, the hum of the city dying as if the world itself had taken a pause. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, thick and alert, like something unseen was holding its breath along with them. Ethan's father moved first, instinctively reaching for his phone. The flashlight's glow sliced through the dark in a trembling cone, sweeping across furniture, catching fragments of their fear in shards of light. Downstairs, Richard whispered. Now. They moved quietly, the old wood floors groaning underfoot. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows, flattening the rain against the glass until it looked like veins of light crawling down. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, long and lonely. When they reached the living room, Ethan noticed it, the faint red blink from across the street. Not a reflection, a lens, a camera watching. Dad. Richard followed his gaze, jaw tightening. He moved toward the window but stopped himself, realizing too late that movement only made them easier targets. Get away from the glass, he said, Ethan's pulse hammered. Who are they? Richard didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the kitchen and yanked open the back door. The alley behind their building was soaked in shadow and rain. "We can't stay here." They slipped into the storm, the rain drenching them instantly, muffling everything except the echo of their footsteps. The air smelled of iron and wet asphalt. Street lights flickered in the fog, each one a heartbeat away from dying. They didn't speak for blocks. Only when they reached an underpass did Richard finally stop, breath heavy. "Ethan, listen to me," he said. "Whatever's on that drive, whoever Henry was running from, it's still alive. Someone doesn't want those files seen." Ethan's fingers tightened around the flash drive in his pocket. "So we find out why?" Richard shook his head. "No, we hand it to someone we trust. We disappear for a while." But Ethan's voice came out sharper than he intended. "Disappear? You built a life running from guilt." "I'm not doing that," the words cut through the rain like glass. For a moment, the only sound was the dripping from the bridge above. Richard looked at him, not as a father looking at his son, but as a man recognizing the reflection of his younger self. "You think this is about courage," he said quietly. "It's not. It's about survival." Ethan took a step closer, eyes burning with something between defiance and fear. "Maybe Henry didn't survive, so I could just run." Richard's face hardened, but before he could speak, a low rumble rose from the street. Headlights appeared in the distance. 2 vehicles, slow, deliberate, moving like predators. They ducked behind the concrete pillars, the sound of engines growing louder. Ethan held his breath, feeling the vibration through the soles of his shoes. The cars stopped. Doors opened. Footsteps splashed into puddles. A man's voice called out, calm and clear through the rain. "Mr. Hale, we're not here to harm you. We just want to talk." Richard froze. Ethan could see the muscles in his father's jaw tighten. He recognized that tone. Polished, patient, the kind that came from years of boardrooms and veiled threats. Another voice joined, lower, older. "You've been digging where you shouldn't. Henry left things unfinished. Things that were supposed to stay buried." Ethan's heart pounded. He whispered, "Who are they?" Richard's eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time Ethan saw something unfamiliar there. Not fear, but shame. "People I once called partners." The men moved closer, flashlights sweeping the dark. One beam caught Ethan's reflection on a wet surface. A shout followed. "There! Run!" Richard hissed. They bolted through the underpass, the sound of boots splashing behind them. The night exploded into chaos. Flashes of light, shouts cutting through the rain, a car alarm blaring somewhere nearby. Ethan's crutch slipped on the slick concrete, but Richard grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. They turned a corner, ducked through a broken fence, and stumbled into an abandoned parking structure. The echo of pursuit faded slowly until only their breaths filled the space. Richard leaned against a wall, drenched, trembling. "They won't stop," he said. "They think Henry left evidence that could destroy them." Ethan looked down at the drive in his palm. The label's ink had started to smudge in the rain, but the faint letters, for EH, still held. "Then we find out what's on this before they do." Richard nodded weakly, but his eyes flickered with conflict. "If we open it, there's no going back." Ethan met his gaze. "Maybe that's the point." They found refuge in an old tech lab Richard once funded downtown, long abandoned but still wired with dusty computers. Ethan connected the flash drive. The machine whirred, humming with life after years of silence. The first folder contained spreadsheets, financial transfers, coded messages between corporations. But then came something else. A series of scanned letters addressed to the Vision Forward board. In them, Henry accused several executives of laundering donations through shell charities and using disability programs as fronts for government contracts. Ethan scrolled faster, his pulse racing. Then he found a final document. A single sentence. "If this reaches anyone, know that Richard Hale was never part of the crime. He was the cover." Ethan's hand froze on the mouse. The screen flickered, the text warping as if the file were being remotely accessed. "Then the black, Dad," he whispered. "Did you see—" Before he could finish, the monitors shut down. A voice echoed from the far corner of the room. Calm, measured, familiar. "You shouldn't have opened that." Ethan spun around. A man stepped out from the shadows, his soaked coat dripping onto the tile. The flashlight he held cast his face in harsh light. Sharp features, graying beard, eyes that seemed to see everything even without sight. Ethan's breath caught. Henry? The man smiled faintly. You were supposed to stay away from this. Richard stepped forward, disbelief cutting through the years of guilt. You're alive. Henry nodded slowly, barely, and for good reason. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the old room in pale fire. Henry looked at the two of them, his expression caught between relief and warning. They're not after me anymore, he said. They're after what I left behind, and now both of you have it. Ethan's voice trembled. Then tell us the truth. Henry hesitated, then said quietly, The truth isn't what you think. The charity, the corruption, I started it. I created the system they used. Your father just made it look legitimate. The words landed like thunder. Richard staggered back. That's not true, he said. I was trying to fund something bigger, Henry interrupted. Something hidden. Research that could restore sight, rebuild limbs. But to keep it alive, I made deals. Bad ones. When it went wrong, I disappeared before they could silence me, and now they think you're my leverage. Ethan's world tilted. Everything he thought he knew, the kindness, the wisdom, the moment in the rain, cracked like glass. Henry stepped closer, lowering his voice. You want to do good, Ethan? Then stop digging, because the truth doesn't set people free. It buries them. Outside, sirens screamed closer, real this time. Flashing red and blue spilled through the cracked windows, painting the walls with fevered color. Henry looked toward the sound. They found me again, he murmured. You need to go. Come with us, Ethan said. Henry's eyes softened. I can't run anymore. Then in a movement too fast to comprehend, he slipped something into Ethan's hand. A small metallic key shaped like a folded wing. Find the vault, he whispered. Before they do, the door burst open behind them and Henry Lowell vanished into the flood of light. The light burst through the doorway like a flood. Sirens wailed, their sound ricocheting off concrete walls, slicing through the room where Ethan stood frozen, Henry's key still clutched in his trembling hand. The chaos was a blur of motion, boots slamming against the floor, commands shouted into radios, the glint of metal under flashing lights. And then, just as suddenly, it was silence again. Henry was gone, not a trace, not a footprint, only the echo of his last words, find the vault before they do. Ethan turned toward his father, whose face was pale and taut, his eyes darting toward the shattered doorway. He was right there, Ethan said. You saw him, Richard's voice cracked. I saw something. But if he's alive, it means everything we thought, everything I thought was wrong. The sound of the rain outside had softened to a whisper now, a calm too quiet for comfort. The computers were dead, screens black, the flash drive melted inside the port. Every piece of evidence gone except the small metallic key Ethan still held, cold, solid, real. He turned it over in his palm, feeling the grooves cut like veins across its surface. A symbol was etched into it, two curved lines forming a shape that looked almost like wings. He remembered the Foundation's logo. Vision forward. The same wings. When they left the lab, dawn was bleeding over the city, the streets glistening from rain, smoke rising from gutters like ghosts escaping the asphalt. They walked in silence, every step heavier than the one before. By morning, the story had spread. News outlets were buzzing about an incident at an abandoned facility tied to Richard Hale, the billionaire philanthropist. Anonymous sources claimed the charity's finances were under investigation again. The narrative had turned on them. The world that once hailed Ethan as the boy with the brave heart now whispered a different name, the boy behind the fraud. He watched it unfold on the television in a small cafe, the words flashing across the bottom of the screen. His throat felt tight, his reflection warped in the glass. Richard sat beside him, unmoving. They're trying to erase him, Ethan said. No, Richard whispered. They're trying to erase the truth, and they'll use you to do it. That night, Ethan couldn't stop hearing Henry's last words. Find the vault. He spent hours tracing the symbol on the key, trying to decode it. Then in a flash of memory it came to him, Henry's conservatory. The piano. The way his hands lingered over certain keys. The logo carved into the piano's frame. The same twin wings. He left before sunrise, slipping out of the apartment without waking his father. The city was still asleep, the streets washed in that soft gray before dawn where everything looks like a memory. The conservatory waited at the edge of town, its glass roof gleaming faintly beneath the clouds. When he stepped inside, the air was still and heavy with the scent of old rain and soil. The piano stood exactly where it had been, silent, patient. Ethan ran his fingers across the keys, each one slick with dust. Then, beneath the middle C, he saw it, a tiny lock hidden within the wood, almost invisible. He slid the metallic key inside. It clicked. A soft hum followed, and from within the piano came the sound of gears shifting. The back panel opened with a slow sigh, revealing a hollow compartment lined with black velvet. Inside was a small drive, older, thicker than the one Henry had given him before. For a moment, Ethan just stared. This was it, the vault. He pocketed the drive and turned to leave, but froze. Footsteps. A shadow moved across the glass wall, slow and deliberate. Then another. He ducked behind a row of overgrown ferns just as the door opened. 2 men entered, flashlights cutting through the dimness. Their suits were soaked from rain, their movements too controlled to be cops. One of them scanned the room, his light pausing over the piano. "Check it," he said. Ethan's heart thudded against his ribs. He held his breath as the man approached. Then from outside an engine roared to life, a car screeching to a stop. A door slammed. "Ethan!" It was his father. The men turned toward the sound, guns drawn, but before they could move, Richard appeared in the doorway, hands raised, his face calm but fierce. "You're looking for me," he said. The taller man stepped forward. "Where's the boy?" Richard's eyes flicked toward the shadows where Ethan hid. Just for a moment. "But enough. Gone," he said. "He doesn't know anything." The man's voice hardened. "You think you can save him by lying?" Richard smiled faintly, the kind of smile that held both defiance and farewell. "It's not a lie," he said quietly. "It's a promise." He moved fast then, grabbing a nearby chair, swinging it into the nearest man before the other could react. The sound of struggle filled the conservatory, shattering glass, thudding impact, chaos. Ethan wanted to run to him to help, but his father's eyes caught his one last time, sharp, pleading, commanding. "Go." And so he did. Ethan slipped out through a side door, the rain swallowing him whole. He didn't stop running until the city swallowed the horizon. He found refuge in a small internet cafe miles away, the hum of computers like static comfort. His clothes clung to him, his crutch a rhythm of metal and desperation. He plugged in the old drive, hands shaking, the screen filled with files, videos, documents, photos. He clicked the first video. It showed Henry, years younger, sitting in a hospital lab surrounded by machines and prosthetics. His voice was calm, resolute. "If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it. The technology we developed, neural reconstruction, could restore sight and motion, but the board saw something else. Weaponization, contracts, profit. I refused. So they destroyed it." He looked straight into the camera. "They'll blame Richard." They already did. But he didn't know. None of it was his choice. He believed me, until I made him the scapegoat. Ethan froze. Henry's voice trembled now, softer. "If you found this, Ethan, it means you're everything I hoped you'd become. Brave enough to seek the truth, human enough to feel its cost. Tell the world what we built. But tell them we failed because we forgot why we started." The video ended. The room was silent except for the faint hum of electricity. Ethan sat there staring at the screen, tears mixing with rain on his face. Everything inside him felt torn open. Anger, grief, understanding. Henry hadn't just been a victim. He'd been both hero and villain. And his father, the man he thought had ruined it all, had been protecting him from a truth too heavy for either of them to carry. He uploaded the files. One by one. When the first news notifications started appearing, he didn't feel triumph. Only release. By the next morning, every major outlet was running the story. Neural reconstruction technology covered up for profit. Whistleblower's legacy uncovered by philanthropist's son. The footage spread faster than anyone could contain it. Henry's name was cleared. Richard's too. But the cost was everywhere. The conservatory was burned that night, arson, they said. The men who had hunted them vanished from record. And Richard. He never came home. Weeks passed. The world moved on. Foundations formed in Henry's name. The government announced an investigation. People hailed Ethan as a symbol again, but he didn't feel like one. He felt hollow, like a bridge that had carried too much weight and finally cracked. One evening, as he stood outside the remains of the conservatory, a figure approached through the twilight, a woman in a dark coat carrying a small envelope. "This was found in your father's office," she said, handing it to him. Inside was a note written in Richard's uneven handwriting. "You were right not to run. You found what I couldn't. If you ever doubt whether it was worth it, look at the people who can see again, walk again, live again. That's your answer." At the bottom, a final line. "Keep walking, son." Even if it hurts, Ethan folded the note, sliding it into his pocket. The last light of the day stretched across the city, golden and broken. He could hear the faint sound of traffic, of laughter, of life continuing. He looked down at the metal key in his palm, the wings engraved, still glinting in the sunset. He smiled faintly, then placed it on the cracked piano frame that still stood amid the ruins. The world had changed, but it hadn't ended. As he turned to leave, he thought of Henry's voice, of his father's, of the sound of rain on glass. The city breathed around him, alive and heavy with memory. Sometimes, he thought, crossing the street isn't about reaching the other side. It's about having the courage to step into the storm, again and again, until the light finds you. And as the wind rose, carrying the scent of rain and earth, Ethan took one slow, steady step forward. The city had begun to forget. The smoke, the headlines, the flashes of scandal that once set the air ablaze had settled into silence. Weeks blurred into months, and the storm that had torn through Ethan's life faded into memory. Not gone, but quiet, like a wound that no longer bled yet never truly healed. The world had moved on. Ethan hadn't. Every morning he walked the same path, past the cafe where he and his father had once sat in uneasy silence, past the corner where he'd helped the blind man cross the street, and finally down toward the river. The skyline shimmered across the water now, brighter, cleaner, as if the city had washed itself of guilt. But beneath that brightness, he could still feel the pulse of something deeper, the cost of truth, the weight of what it takes to be seen. He carried his father's note with him always, folded, worn, soft around the edges from being opened and closed so many times. Sometimes he'd trace the words with his thumb, as though doing so could bring the voice back, that calm, steady tone that could make even chaos sound like something solvable. Across the city, the Vision Forward Foundation had been reborn under a new name, the Lowell Hale Institute for Restorative Innovation. Its mission was the same as it had been before corruption tainted it, to rebuild lives, to make impossible things real again. And this time it was different, transparent, honest. Ethan had made sure of that. He never took credit publicly. He didn't want to. His name appeared nowhere on the board, not on the walls, not in the articles. He wanted it that way. To him, this wasn't a monument to redemption. It was a continuation of something unfinished. One autumn morning, he returned to the conservatory, or what was left of it. The city had cordoned it off for months after the fire, but now the barriers were gone and nature had begun to reclaim it. Ivy crawled along cracked walls. Wildflowers had sprouted between floor tiles. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the roof, scattering golden dust through the air like drifting memory. Ethan stepped carefully over the debris, his crutch making soft, rhythmic taps against the marble. The smell of rain still lingered. Even now, after everything, that same scent of renewal and decay. He found the spot where he'd left the key, resting on the edge of the broken piano. It was still there. He picked it up. It felt lighter now, almost weightless. He imagined Henry sitting there, the light catching his weathered face as he played, the way his blind eyes always seemed to look beyond the room, beyond sound, beyond time itself. He wondered if Henry ever thought this far ahead, if he'd known how much pain and beauty would be born from the lies he told and the truths he buried. Ethan ran his fingers over the scorched keys, pressing one softly. A faint note rang out. Fragile, cracked, but alive. For a moment it felt like the world paused. He could almost hear his father's voice again, steady and warm. "Keep walking, son. Even if it hurts." So he did. He spent the next few years working quietly, not as a leader or a public figure, but as something smaller, truer. An advocate, a mentor, a builder of quiet things. He began a program for children living with disabilities, teaching them how to code, how to create, how to see the world differently even when the world refused to see them. One of them, a girl named Lila, reminded him of himself at her age, curious, stubborn, unshakably hopeful. She had a mechanical prosthetic arm and an imagination that refused to be limited by metal or circumstance. One day, while helping her assemble a small robotic hand, she asked, "Mr. Ethan, did it ever scare you, wanting to help but not knowing if it would matter?" The question caught him off guard. He smiled faintly. "Every day," he said, "but sometimes the smallest thing you do changes everything you'll never see." Lila tilted her head, considering that. "Like helping a stranger cross the street?" Ethan froze. The word struck something deep within him, the echo of a memory of rain and headlights and a gentle hand gripping his. He looked at her, a quiet warmth spreading through his chest. "Exactly like that," he said. That night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan sat alone in the lab. The air was filled with the hum of quiet machinery, prosthetics charging, monitors blinking, tiny hearts of light beating in the dark. On his desk lay a small frame, its glass cracked but its photo still clear. His father and him, years ago before everything changed. He traced their faces with his finger, and for the first time in a long time he didn't feel sorrow. He felt gratitude. He turned off the lights and stepped outside. The city glowed in the distance, alive, endless. The moon hung low over the water, casting silver on the ripples. As he walked along the riverbank, the breeze carried whispers of laughter, the sound of car horns, the low hum of a city that never stopped moving forward. He realized then that the story wasn't about endings at all. It was about continuations, about the invisible hands that push one life into another, the quiet intersections that change everything. He paused by the edge of the water, watching his reflection tremble in the ripples. Behind him, the skyline shimmered like 1,000 unspoken dreams. He thought about Henry, the man who had lived in the gray between good and wrong. He thought about his father, who had carried guilt that wasn't his. And he thought about himself, a boy who once believed kindness was simple until he learned it was the most complicated thing in the world. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of rain. He smiled. Every storm, he realized, leaves something behind. Not destruction, not ruin, but clarity. He closed his eyes and listened. To the city, to the river, to the distant murmur of life unfolding in all its imperfect beauty. And for the first time, he didn't feel like he was searching anymore. He felt like he had arrived. As he opened his eyes, the first drops of rain began to fall, soft and cool against his skin. He didn't move, didn't run for shelter. He stood there, letting it wash over him the same way it had years ago on that street corner when everything began. He wondered, as the rain blurred the city lights into streaks of silver and gold, if maybe that's what life was and what a series of crossings. Each one uncertain, each one a step into the unknown. Maybe some people are meant to build bridges, he thought. Others are meant to walk them. And maybe sometimes the smallest act, a hand reaching into the storm, is what keeps the whole world from falling apart. The river shimmered with reflection. The city breathed. The rain fell harder now, but Ethan only smiled. That quiet, knowing smile that comes when pain has turned into something gentler, something almost sacred. He whispered to the wind, not as a prayer, but as a promise. I kept walking. Then he turned and began his slow, steady journey home. The boy who once helped a blind man cross the street, now a man who had learned that sometimes it's not the other side that matters most. It's the courage to take the first step, and somewhere in the distance, where the rain met the light, it almost felt like someone was smiling back. The city continued to hum. The water kept moving. The world once more was still, and the story, his story, kept on breathing, quietly, endlessly, like the rain,